We're finishing up this sermon series today on 4 Keys to Joy. It's been a real different sermon series for me because we've been looking at a lot of the secular research about what is happening in our American culture and society. I guess specifically, I've been reading for a number of years trying to find out, if you want, maybe this is the best way to put it, why are we coming apart in America? There's no doubt that we are. We've become more tribal, we've become less neighborly, we've become more angry, we've become more lonely, more socially isolated, we're more addicted, more people are dying due to suicides. Those are the facts that we cannot ignore. And so in all these sermons, and especially today, we're going to look at some of the sociological research about what's taking place and then talk about the difference that the church makes in the life of America today. I'm going to read a text that some of you are familiar with, the 10th chapter of Luke. This is the story of the Good Samaritan, but we're not going to read about the Good Samaritan. We're going to cut it off right at the question because that's what we're going to be dealing with today. Just then a lawyer stood up to test Jesus, saying, "Teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life?" Jesus said to him, "What is written in the law? What do you read there?" And he answered, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself." And Jesus said to him, "You have given the right answer. Do this and you will live." But, wanting to justify himself, the lawyer asked Jesus one more question. He said, "And who is my neighbor?" And the story follows. We're going to stop right there. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. A number of years ago, my wife Bobby came up with a great idea. She said, "Don, we're going to start walking in the evenings around our neighborhood. We ought to do that to be, to be more healthy, get some exercise, and just to enjoy the scenery and the outdoors." I didn't really think we needed to do that, but she thought we did, so I said, "Yes, sir." And I'll never forget the first walk we took. We came out the front door, down the walk, and we started down the street. We got to the end of the block, and as we got to the end of the block on the sidewalk, another couple was coming this way, turned and passed us, and they greeted Bobby warmly, and Bobby greeted them warmly. They spoke, and then they went on past us. I turned to Bobby. I said, "Bobs, who were those people?" She said, "Don, those are what we call neighbors." It's a good point, don't you think? Those are what we call neighbors. It's kind of a funny story, and it would be only a funny story if it weren't for the fact that we are living in a world where we have fewer and fewer neighbors. Living in a world where we are splintering apart. Living in a world separated by our privacy fences. Living in a world isolated by our smartphones and other technology, where we in America are literally coming apart. And it's a darn good question to ask, I think, for us today. Who is our neighbor? Where do we find our neighbor? How do we relate to them? I have a good friend who lives out in Balmorhea, Texas. If you've never been to Balmorhea, it's on the foothills of the Davis Mountains. It's a little tiny place, pretty open and wild, maybe 90 miles north of the border. And she sent me an email the other day with this. I thought it was pretty good. "Last night the internet stopped working, so I spent a few hours with my family." They seem like good people. Well, it's funny, isn't it? It's funny. And it would be only funny if it weren't for the fact that we have to face the reality today of the fact that our families in America are fracturing all across our land. That we have families that are more and more broken. We have more children growing up in dysfunctional families. In so many ways, we have forgotten in America what it means to have strong, healthy families. So, we've been writing and preaching these sermons about the keys to joy, trying to diagnose specific things that are happening in our society and how we can address those issues because they're joy killers. They're joy killers in our society. What does the Bible say about these? So I want to show you, this is kind of a way of wrapping up this series, a little bit of a summary. The first Sunday, You can get these. We have a new platform for our video podcast. You can get these on the website real easily. Just go to past sermons. The first Sunday we talked about spiritual emptiness that has been the result of increased secularization of our culture. That's a hard word to say. Our culture has become more and more secular, and to a great extent, we don't support one another in our spiritual endeavors. Spiritual emptiness is a reality in our lives. So we talked about the current opioid epidemic and the millions that are addicted. We talked about the increasing number of deaths of despair, drug overdoses, and suicides. We talked about the increasing sense of isolation in our country. Especially, we hit that on the second sermon, social isolation and loneliness, which has now become so prevalent in America that it's one of the leading causes of death. There are those who say that it is now ahead of obesity as a leading cause of death, and it's a joy killer whenever it takes place in your life or mine. Last week we talked about a lack of purposefulness, the stewardship of our gifts and our talents, and the stewardship of life. That joy comes when we know we've been created by God and that God has given us gifts and a mission, a job, which is important. And then today, kind of summarizing all of this, the fraying of our communities, which has led to some extent to the first three. The fraying of our communities, where we find neighbors, where we find experiences that bring us joy, shared experiences of joy. So I'll show you there. In 2000, a PhD sociologist at Harvard University named Robert Putnam wrote a book called Bowling Alone. Probably many of you have read this book. Almost all of you have heard of this book. I wanted to put it up on the screen because of the subtitle, Bowling Alone, the Collapse and Revival of American Community. He based this book on a 1995 essay he wrote, which came out of some research, really idiosyncratic research, I think, about bowling in America. And this is what he discovered. He discovered that during the 1990s, more people were bowling in America than at any time in our history. But they were bowling alone and not in leagues. Throughout the 20th century, bowling leagues had been very, very prominent in the lives of most communities. Bowling leagues had grown. They were very, very vital, and most people that bowled in leagues. He discovered that suddenly people had stopped bowling in leagues and bowling alone. There are economic repercussions to this. For instance, if you own a bowling alley, you'd rather see people bowling in leagues because guess what? If you bowl in leagues, it's more fun. People buy more snacks, they buy more hot dogs, more popcorn, and drink more beer. When people bowl alone, that's the main source of income for a bowling alley. When they bowl alone, not as much. But Putnam, of course, was fascinated by what this means about our communal life in America. And so he started researching other associations in America. When Alexis de Tocqueville came to America in 1830, he looked around, he traveled all around America, and he said they have a unique form of government. It's extraordinary, but it's not the secret to the American experiment. The secret to the American experiment are the thousands and thousands of what de Tocqueville called associations. The Elks Club, the Lions Club, the Rotary Club, the Garden Club, and more than anything else, thousands of churches across America that gathered people together and helped to have shared values in the life of the communities where those churches were gathered. So as Putnam started doing this research, this is what he discovered. Fewer and fewer organizations or associations. Fewer bowling leagues, fewer garden clubs, Rotary Club. You may be a part of a Rotary Club. You say, our Rotary Club's doing great. But this is now established science. Across America, our organizations and associations which bring people together in community have been in decline. And especially our churches. About 1960, Pew Research started finding out the statistics about church attendance in America, and it started declining, and it's been declining for the most part ever since then. Why are we coming apart in America? Well, I want to say two things from the perspective of the church. First of all, bowling alone, being isolated as human beings, we talked about some of this on week 2, does not work. We were created by God to be social animals. And so whenever we are together, we increase and multiply the opportunities for joy. When we are isolated, we mitigate the opportunities for joy. I'm going to use a real common example. This morning, I was driving around early in the morning. I do that on Sundays, thinking about my sermon. I was driving east on Spring Park. What was that? Spring Creek, yeah. I've only lived here 36 years. I'll get the names of the streets correct. Spring Creek, and it was about 7:15, and there was a remarkable sunrise on the east. It was just stunning. And if you'll stop and think about this, the number of times that you've been in a special place and something happened and you wanted to share it, a sunrise, or maybe a sunset, or maybe a mountain vista. You've hiked up and there's this remarkable mountain vista, maybe a peaceful lake down below. And what did you do? You thought, oh, I wish my wife was here to share this with me. I wish my children were here. I wish my best friend was here to see this. It's one of the most instinctive things we do as human beings, isn't it? And on the one hand, it's kind of an unselfish moment. We say, wow, I wish I could share this. I wish somebody else could see it. But the truth of the matter is, we do it instinctively because we have been wired to be social human beings. We know that if other people could be there to share the joy with us, the joy increases and multiplies. This has happened, I think, to probably everyone here. Maybe you're up in the attic and you're rummaging around in the attic and you come upon something that's really, really special. You'd forgotten about it. Maybe it's the family Bible or an old book that was written by your father or a grandparent. Maybe a certain piece of art or collectible of some kind. And you think, oh, I'd forgotten all about that. And you think, I need to call Mom and tell her about this. Has that ever happened to you? I need to call Mom and tell her about what happened. And that instinct is so strong that you'll have it years after your mother has passed away, right? Am I not right? Years later. It's because that's who we are as human beings. We are made to be together as human beings. We are made to share the joy and multiply the joy with others. So we've been very specific in these 4 keys. We're going to put it right up here. Key number 4 to joy is participating with family and with neighbors in communities where joy is shared and multiplied. It is extraordinarily important to us as individuals. And I'll make the point today that it's important, I think, in terms of the roles that we play, both as individuals and as churches, in weaving together the social fabric of America. What Putnam discovered is that social trust has gone down, what he called social capital has gone down, civic engagement, even the simple act of voting has gone down. People no longer trust Congress, you already know that. And that kind of social capital, social trust is weaved together by people and organizations, and especially across America by churches. So I'm going to finish with a deeply held prejudice of mine. Some of you got a letter this past week. I haven't mentioned this in the other services. It didn't occur to me. Don't think about it a whole lot. But I've got about 18 months left before I retire. And I'll just say to you that at the end of a 47-year career, almost at the end of a 47-year career, I believe in the role of the church in the life of the individual and in the life of the community and in the life of the nation more than ever before. It is a critical and unique time and challenge that we are facing. I said it earlier, I'm going to say it again. America is coming apart. And part of that is because we've forgotten our role as neighbors and peacemakers in our communities and in our nation. There's a phrase that all of you are familiar with. Pew Research has made this phrase pretty famous. They've been tracking church attendance and church and belief in God for a long time, the Pew Institute. And since 1960, the track is pretty clear. Fewer and fewer people attending church and more people who say this: I believe in God and I pray, but I am spiritual, not religious. What they mean by that is that I believe in God and I pray, but I do it by myself. I do it in isolation. I do it when I am alone. And what I want to say to you is that just simply, in the long run, doesn't work. Now, let me tell you what does work. Spiritual practices, lots of spiritual practices that are done alone. From retreats, silent retreats, to prayer, to meditation, all of those are practices that can strengthen our faith and encourage our spirits. But true spirituality always leads back to community, because that's where God calls us to be. True spirituality leads back to a community where the people decide to get together and build a house on the corner. Or back to a community where a Sunday school class decides to have a Christmas store at Dooley Elementary. Or where volunteers put together food packets for people who are hungry. True spirituality always brings us together. Last November, my assistant Charlotte got a phone call from a former member of this church. He's 19 years old. He had attended this church as a youth and he had been confirmed as a youth. And she came back to me, she said, I've got this call from this young man and he's wanting to remember and celebrate his baptism. Said he's enlisted in the Navy and he's getting ready to ship off. And he wants to come and remember his baptism. She said, do we do that kind of thing? I said, you bet we do. So she set it up. I looked him up in our database and saw where he'd been in our youth group and confirmed when he was in the 7th grade. And I called Stephanie Reed-Meyer, our youth minister, and said, Stephanie, I want you to come do this with me. So I didn't really know him or remember him, but he was going to come up here and meet us on a certain date, and he did. But when he walked in, he had this whole group of friends with him, 19, 20, 21 years old. And we invited them in, they sat down right over there where you all are sitting. It was extraordinary. This is a group of young people who had been together since junior high school, and now they were all separated. They were here on, I think it was Thanksgiving break maybe. And I went through one by one and asked them what their name was, what they do, where they went to school. One of them went to school in New Mexico, a couple of them down in South Texas. They were scattered. It was young men and young women. It was multi-ethnic and multiracial. Extraordinary group. And then as I finished, I just said, what are you doing here today? And they said, well, we came here to be with Charlie, to support Charlie. So when we got to the moment where we remembered his baptism, we brought them all up to the baptismal bowl there, and Stephanie and I reached in and put water on our hands and put it on Charlie's head and said, remember your baptism. But we invited them too. And together as a group, they reached out and on his shoulder, on his head, they surrounded him and supported him with their love. And I thought, honestly, in 47 years of ministry, this is one of the most inspiring things I've ever seen. And such irony, people who believe that it's our young people who no longer believe in being together in community, no longer believe in the church. They were here because Charlie believed in the church, and that was good enough for them. They placed their hands on him, and I proclaimed that he is a child of God. He has always been a child of God. God will sustain him in his future, and God will carry him all the way home. And together they said, amen. So isn't that what we're supposed to do and be at our best? Isn't that what's missing so much in America? And isn't that why the church is the one organization that has the unique call? Only the church calls us together because of the love of God. Only the church preaches that we are all brothers and sisters. Only the church preaches that we are all neighbors. What an extraordinary thing, and what an extraordinary time to be in ministry. For me and for you, to answer the clarion call of America that is hurting, and to say, yes, we're all the children of God, and yes, we are stronger together than alone. Thanks be to God. Amen.